Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 47th edition of our In Conversation live series from the Royal Society of Medicine. And this evening, I'm very proud to present to you Dame Lesley Regan, a very famous British gynecologist, professor and head of department of Obstetrics and Gynaecology at Imperial College London. She was elected president of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in 2016, the second woman and the very first in 64 years to hold this position. And in her presidential address, she discussed the importance of a healthy lifestyle for a safe pregnancy and the risks of obesity, and we'll be talking about those. Lesley was appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2020 in the New Year's Honours for services to women's healthcare. In the same year, she became chair of Wellbeing of Women. So hello, Lesley. It's really lovely to have you on our program. I'm very proud that you agreed to do that for us. Lesley, let's start at the beginning and just tell us a little bit about your background. I mean, you're at the top of your profession now. You're quite a famous lady, but how did it all start? Talk us through your career from the beginning.
Thank you, Roger, for inviting me and for being so gracious. And thank you to the RSM for hosting these events, which I think have lightened up the lockdowns considerably. So I don't really know what made me want to become a doctor, because there were no doctors or nurses or anyone in healthcare in my family. And in fact, I've often reflected, Roger, how lucky I was to have the father I did, because although he'd had to leave school at the age of 12 and so had no education to talk to, he was determined that I should go to primary and secondary education, and then if I wanted to go on to university. And I was the first individual in my family to finish their secondary education. But apparently I announced to him on my 7th birthday that I wanted to be a doctor, and he just said, well, you're going to have to work very hard, and of course you can do it. And I think he did instill in me this belief that if you want to do something, you just have to work very hard at it, and you'll get there if you don't give up. So I think particularly now, particularly doing the work that I've been doing over the last decade overseas, where I see that the biggest problem in women's health are poorly educated women and girls, I think to myself how different my career would have been if I hadn't had a father who felt so strongly about girls' education. And where he got his wisdom from, I don't know, Roger, because as I said, he had to leave school at 12 in order to go out and earn money to look after his mother.
And whereabouts were you brought up, Lesley? Which part of the country?
So I was brought up in London, and I lived in London, went to medical school, I went to the Royal Free, had a fabulous time at the Royal Free, because of course that was the medical school that let the boys in. So when I went in 75, it was 50-50 girls and women. So I never really saw this really male hierarchical structure of the other medical schools. And then I qualified in 1980. And then in 1984, after having done various jobs in obstetrics and gynecology and general surgery, I went up to Cambridge. And I went for a year, but I stayed for 7 years. And so I spent a lot of my training years up in Cambridge.
My friend Marcus Setchell, who I spoke to today to get some inside information about you, said you were extremely well organized in Cambridge. You used to organize the exams at Cambridge and get all the patients lined up so that the people could do their physical examinations to help them pass their exams for obstetrics and gynecology. Yes, Marcus is a big fan of yours. So at the Royal Free, I mean, Sheila Sherlock was there as sort of inspirational, successful female doctor. Did she have any influence on you, or who would you say that were the people in obs and gynae, if I can use that expression, who inspired you?
Well, the reason I became an obstetrician and gynecologist is because we had the most extraordinary mentor in a woman called Luba Epstein, who used to come and talk to the first years in the first month about how to have safe sex and enjoy it at medical school. And if I describe to you that this was a woman who'd been refugee twice, the first time from White Russia, she then went to Germany and then was exiled or refugee from Berlin in 1938. She arrived in England, trained as a midwife in order to earn money, and then she went to Edinburgh when the Polish School of Medicine was evacuated there, and she earned her way through medical school by playing poker. And she was the most extraordinary character, really larger than life. I've recognized a few people on the attendees list, and there are a few people from my year who will remember Luba Epstein. And she said to me in the first clinical year, "You are going to become an obstetrician and gynecologist. I have decided." And that's what happened. And every year she picked 2 or 3 of us and made sure that we became obstetricians and gynecologists. So it was sort of a done deal. I did dwell a little bit in the last year, my final year, with going into psychiatry, but she convinced me when I'd gone off that track that I was going to be able to do far more for women's mental health if I was an obstetrician and gynecologist. So
and it must have been pretty male-dominated, obstetrics and gynecology at that time. Was that?
It was, yes, it was. As I say, when I went to the Royal Free, I think I got a very false impression of the hierarchy in medicine because it was 50-50 women. And also we had extraordinary people like Sheila Sherlock and Phyllis George, who was a fantastic surgeon, Luba Epstein. There were a couple of female gynecologists. And we also had this amazing woman called Fanny Gardner, who was the dean, the first ever female dean of a medical school. And my year was known as Fanny's Last Fling, because we had a large number of mature students in it. 1 in 4 of us or something were mature students, or we hadn't gone straight from school. And there were all sorts of strange professions that they'd come from. And the other medical school lecturers all used to think that Fanny had done this as revenge. She admitted us all, and then she retired and didn't have to teach us. But I think that my year did a lot of good stuff, and they were an unusual group, but we've kept in contact. We tried to have our 40th reunion last year, but COVID spoilt that. So we're hoping to get together later this year. But they were a very diverse group and very good.
So after 7 years in Cambridge, which is a fantastic place to study, and particularly in this time of year when the daffodils are coming out along the backs and so on, it's just so lovely. But you made a decision to come back to London, to St Mary's. And in those days, St Mary's was pretty male dominated. They say they used to throw you a rugby ball, and if you caught it, then you were in. And if you dropped it, then you didn't have a chance of getting a place, I remember. Yeah. So talk us through that, your consultant interview, and why you decided to go to St Mary's.
Well, in fact, I got married in 1990, and I inherited 4 stepchildren and decided that I had to actually, sort of try and look after them. So I applied for a job. I'd been planning to stay in Cambridge, and I'd done my research degree there and was very well bedded in there, but I decided I'd go, and St Mary's was one of the first jobs that came up. It was also the rotational job that my senior registrar had rotated to, but I had 2 things against me when I went for that interview. 3 things really. The first was that I'd never rotated down to do the St Mary's End because I'd gone into the MRC to do my research training, and they were cross with me about that. And the second one was that I was a woman, and they had 5 men on the staff, consultant staff, and I was the first ever female consultant. And the third was that I was applying to be a senior lecturer because that was the job that came up. Anyway, I do remember the very first morning in 1990 when I arrived, and one of my senior consultant colleagues who's no longer with us saying to me, "Well, it's a very sad day for the rugby team today, isn't it?" And thought it was a terribly funny joke, but I can remember being quite taken aback by that and thinking, "Oh, I'm not sure how I'm going to manage here." But anyway, I never think it's sensible to give up at the first post, so I just got in there. And he did end up being quite a big supporter in the end when he realised that I could pull my weight and I wasn't going to go off and get flaky, as he used to call it. Can't stand them when they're flaky, So,
I got a couple of questions coming in from a couple of big hitters. The first one is Sir Simon Wesley, our my immediate predecessor as president, who actually is appearing on Desert Island Discs on Sunday morning at 7 o'clock. I better give them a plug for that. And it's been repeated on Friday, of course, at 9 o'clock. So good luck on that, Simon. I think it's already been recorded, so there's no luck in it, actually. Simon says, do you ever wonder why so many men do gynecology? It's quite a good question.
Yes, Simon, but I would turn that straight back to you and say, well, you're the psychiatrist, a very eminent one, and I think you should be addressing that question. Perhaps you'll address it on Desert Island Discs. I've often thought about it, and sometimes my conclusions haven't been that charitable. But all I can say is that I think the tide is turning. I joined a group of 6 consultants, the first ever female. We now have 24 consultants, and 18 of them are female. 80% of our trainees are now women. So my hope is that given time, they will move to the top. And I don't think that we should get rid of men completely. Far from it. I think they add a dimension too. But undoubtedly, it is a very attractive specialty for many women. And delivering babies and looking after women's health across the life course. I find it absolutely fascinating, the diversity of the questions or the problems that women face throughout their life course, and the fact that for so long, Roger, you and I were trained to work in a disease intervention service, and women have such predictable healthcare needs that you only have to sit down with a sheet of paper and just map them out, and you can immediately work out what they're going to need. And then women are particularly well versed to be helping us to deliver really good healthcare, because they represent 51% of the population and they affect the health behaviour of everybody else in society. So one of my mantras has always been, if you get it right for women, that everybody benefits. And there's all sorts of economic and epidemiological arguments to support that, the health and wealth of nations are determined by the health of its girls and women.
Yeah,
I firmly believe that. And I also think we should be recruiting girls and women to be ambassadors and to help, if you like, dictate what's going to happen to them in the future, rather than doing things to them.
I'm just going to read out another question, because Simon and I get criticized if we don't use some of the questions. We do love it when people send questions in, but sometimes, we get 100 questions, so it's actually impossible. They flick up in front of you and in an alarming way. So apologies if we don't always get that right. But John Shepherd, Professor John Shepherd, very eminent gynecologist and keen sailor, says, Leslie, you're a wonderful role model for all our daughters who worship you, of course. I'm sure they do. You epitomize the aphorism, if you want a difficult job done, ask a busy expert. But he says, do you know and remember there's a real world, perhaps another world out there? I think he might be implying that you work too hard, Leslie.
Oh, well, it's John, just because you've been down on the Isle of Wight sailing, I think, throughout the whole of the COVID pandemic. But yes, there is a world out there, and I enjoy it very much. I've got 2 fabulous twin daughters who, through the last year, have been living with me. And I spend a lot of time listening to music, and when I could going to the opera, going to the theatre. So yes, I do realise there's a real world out there, and I do enjoy it. But I do also love working, and at the moment there's so much to change in women's health, and particularly post this COVID pandemic, there is an enormous amount to put back and try and level up again.
I think that you, Sally Davis, and Claire Marks, and probably some others I haven't mentioned, had made such a fantastic contribution, and it's great that all 3 of you have now appeared on our program. So we're proud of that. You mentioned your 2 daughters, the twins. It's Claire and Jenny, I think,
That's
isn't
right.
it?
Well done.
One of them's a trainee doctor up in is it Leicester? Or yeah,
Right.
Well, let's give her a bit of a plug, because we get lots of medical students listening to this program. So, I mean, any tips for young trainee doctors now? It can't be that easy for them with the COVID crisis, although I guess their training has been continued whilst other students have been sent home, but it must be difficult. So, I mean, just tell us.
I think it is difficult, and Jenny and Claire, being twins, are both 28, obviously. So they both did arts degrees first time, and so Jenny went back to school, I think, very bravely a couple of years ago to do science A levels, which wasn't easy. And then she got into Leicester Medical School and is in her 2nd year. She's working incredibly hard. She seems to be very, very focused on it. It is hard, but I think that all of the deans of medical schools, I suppose worldwide, but certainly to my knowledge in the UK, have all been asked to prioritise getting their medical students through the course and ensuring they're as supported as possible. And I know in Jenny's year, I believe that a lot of the face-to-face stuff is being reserved for the students in the clinical years, and she's doing most of her stuff online. But you know, online teaching is not perfect, but you know, it has evolved dramatically, and it's certainly quite interactive. It may be on a Zoom platform, but it's certainly pretty interactive. So I think she feels positive about it. I hope so.
We've got a question here from...
She's going to go into women's health, and then she can take over from me, can't she?
We actually got a question from Vittoria Tori. She says, what advice would you give to medical students who want to become gynecologists? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, yes, please, just come and talk to me about it, or come and talk to another gynecologist. I'm sure that we'll give you a very positive background to it, because it is just such a fabulous specialty. That you do a little bit of medicine, you do a bit of surgery, you do a bit of psychiatry, you do a bit of sociology, you can do public health. I mean, I've gone through, you know, being a researcher into the immunology of pregnancy and repeated miscarriage, to working on the commonest reason why women go to gynecology clinics, which is heavy bleeding due to fibroids and things like that. And now I'm really tilted towards the public health issues, which actually are about women's health as opposed to sorting out women's diseases when they present with symptoms. So, and that's before we talk about the extraordinary joy that you feel, anyone will feel, when they are present at the delivery of a baby. I mean, I still remember the first time as a medical student, and you know, the last time I did a cesarean section, to any obstetrician watching, and I haven't done one for a while, but still feeling a bit sort of weepy and tearful as I pulled the baby out, much to the absolute amazement of the SHO who was with me that day. But I was getting teary about this. I think he just saw me as the bossy person and didn't realize that it was still very, very emotional when you bring a new life into the world. So it is the most fabulous specialty. So any medical student that's listening, I do hope you come into Obs and Gynae. We need you, and women's health needs you, and there's something for everybody.
Well, we'll talk about your report, Better for Women, which I think is a very important document in a minute. But before we finish on your career, Lesley, and this issue of how it's more difficult for women to get to the very top of medicine than it is for men, and maybe that needs to change for all the younger people who are watching this program. Just tell us then, at St Mary's, you're now a consultant, you got through your interview, and then you you eventually became the second ever woman president of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists. I mean, how weird is that only 2 women have ever been in charge of that organization? That says quite a lot about the sort of structural sexism, really, that there are in quite a few of the colleges. The Royal College of Surgeons has just done an excellent review on inclusion and diversity in surgery in general, but actually probably a lot of the lessons there could be applied to obstetrics and gynecology. But tell us, how did you achieve that? I mean, do you need sharp elbows to get there? Did you have to sort of climb your way up the greasy pole that the politicians talk about to get to be that second lady president?
Well, my only female predecessor was an extraordinary woman called Hilda Lloyd, and she was president from 1949 to 52. And having read her diaries, I'm amused that she obviously had very similar problems to contend with, all sorts of problems with buildings and hierarchies and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, this was the year after the NHS had been introduced. And there are a lot of women who've done an enormous amount in obstetrics and gynecology and not quite made it to president. So one of the things I had in my office when I was president was 6 life-size black and white photographs of some of those women. Hilda Lloyd was one of them, but Margaret Fairley, Anne Anderson, you know, a group of women who, Josephine Barnes, who had done an enormous amount in our specialty, but had either run for president and not got there, or perhaps hadn't run, but I thought they needed to be recognised. But things are changing, and I think it's going to be time before they change. And it also needs those women who've got there to make sure that when they've gone through that glass ceiling or up the escalator or whatever euphemism you want to use or metaphor, that they ensure that they leave a very clear path for other women to follow them. And I always come back to that fantastic Madeleine Albright saying, you know, the US Secretary of State, who said, you know, there's a special place in hell reserved for women who don't help other women. And I think it's absolutely crucial that women who've got to positions of seniority and authority do help other women in a very proactive way.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that the report from the Royal College of Surgeons that Dame Kennedy produced has suggested that at least one of the vice presidents has to be a woman, so sort of positive discrimination, and they need to change their council, which is mainly middle class, middle-aged or older white males, and I think that message is coming through, and it needs to percolate through other colleges. And to be honest, it probably needs, we can improve things at the RSM. I think we could, we need to be more inclusive and more diverse at the RSM too. So let's get on to your report, Better for Women, because there are 23 recommendations there. I don't think we'll go through all of them, but we can choose a few interesting ones. I mean, just putting together a report like that, I think it was 83 pages of it. That's an awful lot of work, Lesley. And when the government comes up with reports, they have a whole host of scribes and researchers to help them do it. But when a college does it, it's a lot of work. So tell us how that actually happened, because it's fantastic that that you achieved it, and it's still there on the website.
Yeah, so there it is. I've got a hard copy, Better for Women. So, and anyone who wants it, just email me and I'll send them a PDF. So it was a bit of a labour of love, and it gives me opportunity, your question, to thank some of the people who made such an enormous contribution to it. So the RCOG did put a lot of resource into it, because, as you said, it takes time to research it, to get all the stuff together, to illustrate it so beautifully. We undertook a survey of nearly 4,000 women to find out actually what women wanted and what problems they were facing. And then we tried to set about the problems that they were facing. And we divided the report into 3 themes. Problems with access to accurate education and information, harnessing all those women to be ambassadors and advocates for themselves and for their own health and that of their family. And then the importance of prevention over disease intervention and empowering women to know what they need to do. And the third theme to it was commenting on the fragmentation and access to services, which has disproportionately disadvantaged women, I think, for several decades now. But importantly, in those criticisms inherent in the report, for everything that we criticised, we came up with a practical solution to resolve it and to change it. And also something that was going to be more cost effective. So I did toy with having a strapline. It was better for women and better for less if we did it properly. But I do want to say to 3 people who did an enormous amount of work, Zoe Moulton and Stephen Hall and Kate Lancaster, the current chief executive, who really did put an enormous amount of energy and effort into it all. I know a lot of other people did help too, but Zoe in particular was there right up until the last line. I'm sure she was cursing me because I was always changing things right until the last moment before it went to the final publisher. But they did an enormous amount, and I couldn't have done it on my own. They were a fantastic team. And what we set out to do was to write a report that anyone could read. So it was pointed out to me that this wasn't the usual format of a health policy document. And I rather naughtily said to them, yes, well, perhaps that's why policy documents sit on shelves gathering dust or sit on people's hard drives. We want something that everyone can understand. And I think that's what that report has achieved.
Of those 23 recommendations, I've got them all listed here actually. Which would you, I mean, the most topical, because of the Sarah Everard murder in Clapham Common, so devastatingly reported and such a dreadful thing. I mean, let's arbitrarily choose that, because that was one of your recommendations, that there should be a move to try and reduce violence against women, and that's a global issue, not especially UK issue, but it is a major issue. So you were, I mean, ahead of the game to pick up on that. I mean, let's just talk a little bit about that. I mean, it's easy to say, we should reduce violence against women. It's not so easy to achieve it. How would we achieve that?
Well, I think it's a very, very important question. It's obviously very, very topical. I mean, the overarching recommendation of that report is that we need a women's health strategy that goes right across the life course, and then all of these things can slot in. And if you have a women's health strategy across the life course, then that gives you a voice and an opportunity to highlight or focus all of those taboo subjects that people don't talk about. And I'm going to come back to the violence against women, but there's, you know, access to contraception, the most cost-effective intervention in healthcare. It's difficult, really difficult currently. Access to abortion, whatever you feel about it, if you have a society where it's difficult to access or illegal, girls and women die. The problem doesn't go away. And fertility services. And violence against women is another issue. It is thought of as, I think rightly, it's the silent pandemic that has accelerated and been exaggerated by the COVID-19 lockdown. And 1 in 3 women on this call tonight or on this Zoom platform tonight will have been affected by this problem, if not physical abuse or sexual harassment and coercive control. So it's very, very common, and it doesn't have any societal boundaries. It goes right through every infrastructure and right through every country. The prevalence in the UK is no different really from Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think one of the problems that we have is that it's such a big issue that people are paralyzed by the enormity of it, and they start to think, well, why doesn't someone do something about it? And I think what you and I need to do now, Roger, is to persuade everybody that it's everybody's business and everyone has got to do something about it. And one of the things that I found myself reflecting on and listening to people's views about was this, if you like, this somewhat of a backlash to the Sarah Everard murder and the enormous outpouring of grief and anger by women across the UK, and the concern and the distress and the offence that some men have voiced, and they're saying, you know, not all men. And my response to that is that it's actually quite a weak argument, that not all men. Of course it's not all men, but we've got to get everybody involved in changing what the problem is. And I listened to a very interesting podcast, which my other twin daughter, Claire, shared with me yesterday. And it was talking, it was on The Guardian today in Focus, and it was entitled, Men, What Can You Do to Fight Misogyny? And the individual who was talking about it, Jackson Katz, was pointing out that when you say not all men, it's a little bit like saying it's not your issue, but it is, it's everybody's issue because it's so prevalent, we've all got to do something about it. But the analogy that's really stuck in my head, and I share with you now because I think it's very powerful, is that it's a little bit like saying that because I'm a white woman and I don't think I exhibit racial behavior to black people or BAME people, that racism isn't a problem. But you and I know that's not true. So if people say, or if men say not all men, then they're effectively negating it. And I think the other thing we've got to do in our language is turn things around. So we talk about how many women are raped or how many schoolgirls are sexually harassed. Perhaps we need to turn the language the other way around and talk about how many men rape women or assault women, how many young boys or teenage boys get involved in sexual harassment. So I think it's a question about language. It's an enormous problem, but it means that everybody's got to own it and try and change it. It can't be girls doing one thing or women doing another thing and men doing another. We've got to jointly own it.
I think, you know, what's interesting when we're talking about these issues, which are issues across the board, you know, a lot of doctors, I think, focus on their own specialty. You know, I did prostate surgery and I learned more and more and more about prostate cancer and so on. But since I came to the RSM, I've been more and more interested, like you, in more issues that cover the whole of society and the whole of the globe, really. And I think that doctors do have this influential position where they can change opinions in society, because all doctors look after lots of patients and they have a lot of prestige held in esteem by their patients. So talking to their patients about these issues, just exactly as you say, carries the potential for changing behaviors. But the other thing about your report, when I was looking through it, is I like the idea of sort of the whole life care for women, rather than intervening, just for pregnancy, delivering the baby, then off you go, taking that opportunity to think about morbidities that will develop over time. So just talk a little bit about the practicality of that.
Well, as you know, Roger, I spent a long time developing a very specialist research and clinical program into recurrent miscarriage, which is very important, and I still do some of that work. But it was almost a chance meeting that I went to hear Michael Marmot talk in 2010 when he published his report, Fair Society, Healthy Lives. And it was a bit like a light bulb moment. I mean, I had a bit of an epiphany. I hadn't really understood before about how healthcare that you and I were trained to deliver only cures or solves a third of the problem, and that the other 2/3 are determined by the social determinants of disease and where you were born, how you were educated, etc., etc., etc. And I started thinking very much more about what could I do. I got brought in by the then president at the RCOG to participate in working on a report called High Quality Women's Health, in which I think everyone was rather shocked when I talked about a life course and a trajectory, and the fact that, you know, most women from the age of 11 have 12 menstrual periods a year for 40 years of their life, but we don't talk about periods. And because we all live now to our 7th, 8th, 9th decade, it's an inevitability that women become menopausal, and yet we don't talk about it. And both women having menstrual problems, just to give you a for instance, and women having menopausal problems find that they miss school, miss going to work, have problems with their family life, their professional lives, and we could do so much more to improve the quality of their life if we were to think about their needs across the life course, which, as I was saying earlier, are actually not clever. It's very, very predictable what women are going to need. And I think that was important during my time at the RCOG, because I had regular meetings with ministers and individuals, and because I was always banging on about women's health and how important it was, you know, to determine the health and wealth of a nation. There was one point when the 10-year plan was getting sorted out, or perhaps it was an adjustment to it, I forget now, when one of the senior people said, "Oh, well, you must be really pleased because here it is, it's all there, women's health." And I said, "Well, where is it?" And they said, "Well, this whole thing about maternity safety and children." And I said, "Well, that epitomizes the problem, that you see women as being incubators of babies and delivering them. But actually, that's only a small part of their lives, and the rest of their life course is really, really important. And it's actually what determines their health, their well-being, and the way that they use NHS resources." And I think that's something else that I feel possibly the COVID issues have brought out more, that we've tended to think of health as being a drain on resources, that it's a costly business that's necessary. And I think we've got to turn it around, as Sally Davis would say, to thinking about health as being an enormous asset and how everybody needs to contribute to maximising it. So it's really thanks to Michael Marmot that I sort of turned my focus, not away from recurrent miscarriage and fertility issues, but thought, oh my goodness, I could make a bigger contribution if I thought about this more in a public health way, and certainly across a life course, and persuade the RCOG to take that role, which they did, and they were incredibly helpful about helping me facilitate that.
That gives me a chance to give a plug for next week's In Conversation Live, where Sir Michael Marmot is actually talking, and we'll be talking with him about inequalities and the way that COVID has exacerbated those, and what can be done. And another plug actually is for, I think your report has stimulated the government into activity, because by chance on my Twitter feed today, there's a survey, Talk Women's Health, and they're asking women to sign up on that 15-minute survey and send that back in. I guess they'll be doing a government report. They'll probably pinch all your ideas and claim that they were theirs. But
well, that doesn't matter, Roger, you see, because I'm a firm believer that you can travel a lot farther and a lot faster if you don't mind who gets the credit along the way. So they can take all 23 recommendations, or the ones that aren't over the line, and they can use them. But they launched it on International Women's Day, the 8th of March. And it's a 12-week consultation, and please, everybody who's listening tonight, put in your sixpennyworth, trying to make it trying to make a health strategy for women, so that we don't find ourselves in a decade's time still worrying about why is it that we've still got a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. Why is it that we've still got women being seriously disadvantaged by fractured commissioning and silly hierarchical payment structures? Just put women at the middle and build the services around them. Because most of the time women go to healthcare facilities or professionals, they're not ill, they're just trying to do something to maintain their life, you know, contraception, antenatal care. sorting out your menopause problems or your period problems. These are not illnesses. They're very easy to resolve if you know where to go. And I think that brings me back to, let's not waste the incredible power that women have to influence health behaviours and to help themselves, and just make them advocates for themselves and a part of the solution going forward. And in particular, you mentioned about pregnant women, and I think that's a really important area of learning for everybody that we've steadfastly ignored for years and years and years. You know, women behave during well, a woman's response to her pregnancy physiologically very often gives key messages about what her later life medical problems are going to be. So rather than just sort of parceling her off, as you said, Roger, after the baby's delivered, a la Margaret Atwood and The Handmaid's Tale, just incubate and drop the baby and then off you go. We need to, I think, instigate really comprehensive postnatal checks for women, so that if they've had a bit of high blood pressure or they've had a bit of gestational diabetes, we know they're going to get cardiovascular disease earlier. We know that they'll get type 2 diabetes by the age of 50. And importantly, 1 in 5 women are going to have some form of mental health problem during their pregnancy or the first year after their baby's born. And that is absolutely pathognomonic for them needing mental health services later. So if we could identify them early and help them, we would actually be improving their lives and doing it a lot cheaper as well.
That's a very powerful message. Let's go back to the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And when you were there, you took the rather important political decision, and I use the word advisedly, to move the college from the very posh surroundings of Regent's Park, where the average house price is about £10 million, to Southwark, which is a kind of much buzzier area. And in the same way, Claire Marks, I think, made some rather important decisions on behalf of the Royal College of Surgeons and got quite a bit of flack, I think, from some senior members of the college. Just talk us through that decision, and then how you came to it, why you made it, how much flack you got for it, and what's been the outcome.
Well, it was really a no-brainer. We had a lease. It was a Crown Estate property. It's a very beautiful building, but everybody had ignored the fact that the lease was running out. So I could answer this very soon. It was a no-brainer. I got an awful lot of flack, but it was a fantastic outcome. That's the short answer. But the reality was that we were having a diminishing lease, and after many investigations, it transpired that the Crown Estate would be charging us not at 15 or 20 or 25,000 pound peppercorn rent when we renewed the lease. They were going to need something in the region of £1.5 million a year. And so you just have to ask yourself the question, well, you know, what part of women's health are we not going to do? What part of the advocacy are we going to give up in order to pay that bill? And then we had the most extraordinary once in a lifetime opportunity when the London Business School, who were co-located just next door, wanted that particular building. So we were able to get a sum of money that allowed us to buy a freehold property in Southwark, as you said, right next door to Borough Market and Guy's Hospital. They were also able to, you know, and the Crown were also happy. So, but the answer to your question is I got a lot of flack for it, a lot of flack. And of course, the obvious comment, or the predictable comment, was, you see what happens, you put a woman in charge and she sells the crown jewels, or she sells the building or the college. But I think it's had really good positive outcomes. First of all, the Faculty of Sexual and Reproductive Health, and led by their wonderful president, Asha Kasliwal, agreed that they were going to come with us to there. And also the other thing, which I think is really important for our specialty of obstetrics in particular, is that the Royal College of Midwives have now co-located to that building. And I think that's incredibly important for our specialty. So my thanks to Asha Kasliwal and Jill Walton, the Chief Executive of the RCM, for taking those brave steps, because they weren't easy for them either. So we weathered the storm, the three of us often doing it together. Interesting that it was 3 women, and we moved down there, aided by all the RCOG team and all the other college teams. And I think that once we've emerged from the pandemic, the building is fabulous and will be a much better fit for what we want to do in the future. And you'll have to come and visit it, Roger.
I'd love to.
Very lovely.
Will it have a different sort of vibe? Because I visited the Regent's Park building, and it seemed, a little bit cavernous and austere. Would be two words that.
Yes, well, I don't think it's austere at all. It's be a beautiful conversion. I won't go into too much about the details of the building, but got the most fabulous spiral staircase in a courtyard between two buildings which have been joined together, and a great big glass atrium flung over the top to bring it all together. And I think it's really very lovely. And I know that before the pandemic struck, that everyone was very much enjoying it opening up and starting to be used. And we'll get back to that soon. We'll get back to it. But it is lovely that the faculty's there and the Royal College of Midwives is there as well, because I think it's going to mean that in the future there will be so much, the collaborations will become so much more natural and easy. And that's really, really important for women's health.
Well, Philip Asper is asking a question about medico-legal issues in obstetrics and gynecology. But before we come to that, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between midwifery and obstetricians, because a lot of the safety issues from Telford and from Shrewsbury and from out in Kent have come between this kind of what's the word? The conflict, is it, between midwives and obstetricians, or disagreements about fetal monitoring, et cetera, So, I mean, I think being in the same building, the same front door, has got to be a positive. But is that something? Is that rivalry? Perhaps that's a better word than conflict. Rivalry is that subsiding now, or is it still there? Do you think, Lesley?
Well, I think it's very much subsiding, but you can never be too complacent about these things. And if I look at Morecambe Bay, Quumtaf, Shrewsbury and Telford, East Kent, Northwick Park, all maternity disasters and safety issues, all that I've been well, not necessarily been involved with, but I've read the reports of or been involved in investigating in some way. They all have a common theme. And the theme is really when you don't have mutual respect between the two major health professionals in maternity care, midwives and doctors, that things go wrong. And you get polarized opinions. You have too little too late as an intervention, or over medicalized and too much too soon. Obviously, maternity safety and the safety, there's two people to damage if the labor goes badly wrong, the mother and the baby. And too often, I think it's because there isn't mutual respect between these two healthcare professionals that are delivering care. And one of the things that I'm particularly grateful to Jill Walton, CEO of the RCM, for, not just her friendship and collaboration and support, was that her absolute determination to come on this sort of roadshow that we went on for 18 months together. And we called it One Voice and a Shared Purpose. And my contribution to that was always to point out to whoever we were speaking to that it's midwives and not obstetricians who are the common denominator in every maternity. So it's a midwife that's always present. Obstetricians are not always there. And that we needed to show appropriate respect from my specialty towards our midwifery colleagues. And that what we needed to do is not be talking about normal or abnormal, or this or that, or too much intervention, or what all of these polarized views. We need to be talking about one voice and a shared purpose for a woman and a baby, and her baby, I should say, to have a good birth. Mm-hmm. Irrespective of how it comes out, to have a good birth. And that, I'm sure, is the answer to improving maternity safety and the horrible things that happen, babies that are injured during labour and intrapartum. And I very much hope that we'll be able to get the fetal monitoring task force that I started off and my successor has taken over very ably, which is a collaboration between the RCM and the RCOG to organise a national training programme for multidisciplinary training. You've got, if you want people to work well in a crisis, and there's nothing like a labour ward for teaching people how to prioritise and how to manage a crisis. Things, the decisions, the really important decisions on the labour ward are usually taken by the person with the least experience, and that's the baby. And you're just stuck there having to deal with it. So I think that we need to really ensure that we train together, we have mutual respect, and that way we can provide one voice with a shared purpose, which is a healthy baby and a healthy mother at the end of the pregnancy.
Does the college or the College of Midwifery have a view on home births? Are they encouraged, discouraged, or are you neutral?
Well, I think home births have always been a bit of a contentious issue because of fears of safety. But there are some women who have a very happy time having a home birth. And remember, of course, it's the midwives then that take the load of responsibility because they're the ones that need to go to the home with the woman. So, I mean, in women who've got low risk pregnancies, I've got no objection to people having home births. I don't want to object to anybody doing what they want to do. My job, of course, is to point out if I think that they've got risk factors that would make that less safe for them. The number of home births is dramatically reduced over and above previous years. And I think possibly the answer are the birthing units that are often integrated now into maternity units, so that if there are problems, and these problems, or if there are problems that develop in a labour unexpectedly, then you can transfer the woman very quickly to a more technical or high-tech environment. So the one, for example, at St Mary's happens to be on the ground floor, and just round the corner or up one floor is the delivery unit. That doesn't suit everybody, but I think it's a good compromise, particularly in a hospital that's dealing with a lot of complex pregnancies and maternities.
And then coming back to Phil Asprey's question about medico-legal issues, in fact, we've got Bertie Lee, the very famous solicitor who deals at Hempsams with medical legal issues, talking on this program in a few weeks from now. So we can ask him the same question, because I know he would say, you know, obstetrics and gynecology is a major issue in terms of medical legal, simply because of the expense of the settlements. And
it's dramatic. It's dramatic. I mean, obstetric claims are 10% of the numbers that go to NHS resolution, and they are 50% of the payout. So if a baby is damaged during pregnancy and the delivery, the lifetime payments are absolutely massive. So the reality is, and that's why I mentioned the RCM-RCOG fetal monitoring task force, is that if we can develop a program that can be rolled out nationally to improve multidisciplinary training that really makes obstetricians and midwives really aware, situationally aware of what's happening, not just watching the little squiggles on the CTG, much beloved by lawyers, of course, but it make them situationally aware of how is that baby? Is the baby actually well, or is it unwell? You know, did it come into this labour already compromised, or was it okay? Not just relying on squiggles on a trace. For every, you know, if you just save one of those babies with brain damage or cerebral palsy, you pay for the whole training package on an annual basis. So I think that's a no-brainer too. We've got to get better at this, and I think there are opportunities now, as I say, with this collaborative working and doing this in a multidisciplinary, respectful way. And I really, really hope that that task force will be funded properly to go forward, because I think it's the single most important contribution we can make to maternity safety going forward. And it has to be run by the professionals who are the people on the front line.
Well, we've got a question from, I'm proud of myself because I'm asking so many people's questions today, although we've got 42, so we can't get through them all. But Sasha Nathan, thank you for your question. Sasha says, you've recently taken on the chair role at Wellbeing of Women. What are your early plans for helping this charity improve the lives of women? It's a good question.
Well, thank you, Sasha. And that's very lovely that you joined tonight. Thank you, because Sasha's actually is my clever card, because Sasha is trying to help me change Wellbeing of Women. So Wellbeing of Women is a charity that funds every aspect of women's health from cradle to grave. Historically, it's focused on pregnancy issues, I think, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, and I think is now getting much more focused on all those other issues across a woman's life course that also need research and good care. So the charity has traditionally funded research projects to improve aspects of women's health, and also importantly training fellowships for nurses, for midwives, and for junior doctors, so that they can become the next cadre of experts in women's health going forward. And I think that can't be overestimated, how important that training is of the next generation. But with Sasha's help and with Janet Lindsay, who's our lovely chief executive, and with the other trustees. What we're trying to do is to make this, make well-being of women the charity that everybody thinks about when they think about women's health. In the same way that when I went to the RCOG as president, I wanted to make it the go-to place. I'd like Wellbeing of Women charity to be the go-to place, not just for funding or to attract funding for research, for training, but also to be advocates for women's health, being an providing educational tools and information for women to be able to help themselves. Because I've mentioned it a couple of times in this interview, Roger, but I really firmly believe that we miss a trick when we don't recruit women as their own advocates and their own ambassadors to help plot their own pathway. They're really very effective if you give them the right tools with which they can help be part of the solution. And I believe that Wellbeing of Women's got an incredibly important role to play going forward. And this is my opportunity to thank everybody who's contributed in the past to Wellbeing of Women, and to thank this fabulous team of people who are prepared to roll up their sleeves and help us change direction. And I very much hope that we're going to be very successful. In fact, I'm determined we're going to be successful. But thank you, Sasha, for coming tonight and for all the help you've been giving me.
Well, a little bird told me, well, actually it wasn't a little bird, it was Sir Marcus Setchell, told me that you'd had some help from Wellbeing of Women when earlier on in your career, they sponsored some of your research. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And so that's one of the reasons why when Sir Marcus Setchell and Sir Victor Blank sort of pinned me, metaphorically, my arms behind my back and nailed my feet to the floor, said, you know, you really do need to think about coming to chair this charity. I really couldn't say no, because when I was a junior pixie in Cambridge in the middle 1980s, trying to find some money to start up my research program into recurrent miscarriage, it was Wellbeing of Women that gave me my first pilot grant to, well, my first very small grant to collect pilot data with which I was then able to attract bigger funding. And I think that's been something that Wellbeing of Women has done very well over the years. It actually funded people who are very junior, given them a bit of a leg up so that they can collect some information together, get some data, and then go on to do other things. And then I went on to work with the MRC there in the embryo and gamete research unit. And then I developed my own clinical and laboratory research program into recurrent miscarriage. But once again, you know, I'm not sure how my career would have gone if I hadn't had that helping hand right at the beginning. So I'm very grateful to them, and as a result of that, I'm going to see what I can do to help increase the funding and the awareness of Wellbeing of Women as a charity, looking at every aspect of women's health from cradle to grave.
Well, time flies when you're talking to a good communicator, and it's 6 minutes to 8, so we've got 6 minutes left. But let's just briefly talk about your role in global women's health, Lesley, because the overpopulation of this planet is contributing to climate change, and climate change is going to wreck the lives of our grandchildren and our children quite possibly. So just briefly, in a nutshell, tell us a little bit about your experiences in Africa.
Well, I was very struck, well, I'd always been quite interested in global health, and I traveled quite a lot to Africa. But I was very, very excited when I was approached by a member of the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation in 2014 to see whether I would be interested in running a program via the RCOG when I was vice president of the RCOG. And what we did, in a nutshell, to follow your instructions, Roger, was we set up this program. It was a multi-million pound program called Leading Safe Choices. And it was to provide post-delivery contraception and safer abortion care in 2 countries in Africa, the Western Cape of South Africa in the foothills of Tabletop Mountain, and Tanzania in the foothills of Kilimanjaro. Very successful in terms of, I think I mentioned earlier, you know, contraception is, and this is a fact, indisputable fact, it's the most cost-effective intervention in healthcare. If you can provide women with the tools they need to decide if, when, how many times and with whom they get pregnant or are impregnated, you can do an enormous amount in terms of their educational achievements, their working lives, their professional lives, and the outcomes of their pregnancies. And similarly, very short birth intervals, which are very common in countries without contraception, are linked to every single complication of pregnancy is exaggerated. So it was a really, really very successful program. But interestingly, what I found when we set up the program, and it ran for 4 or 5 years, and I should just mention as well that it was only about a year or 2 years ago now that I went back to Cape Town to hand back the program to the Western Cape authorities. So it wasn't a question of, you know, somebody comes in a helicopter or a parachute, does some good stuff and then pushes off again. They really adopted the program, and it's done an enormous amount for women's health, which the RCAG and I are very proud of. But it also gave me the success of this program and working out how to get this embedded into both urban and rural communities. Just gave me an ability to talk to civil servants at the Department of Health and ministers, Jeremy Hunt at the time, subsequently Matt Hancock, and said, well, how can we do this under Tabletop Mountain and under Kilimanjaro? And we can't do it in Paddington or Brixton. You know, we've actually got to have a women's health strategy that prioritises the things that really matter to women. And that global health experience really allowed me to be able to say, we can do this and we can do it better if we just think about what women really need, as opposed to, you know, what we've commissioned our services to deliver. And I think that was quite effective. And all I had to do really was to explain to them or remind them that, you know, the unplanned pregnancy rate in the UK is 45%. The first time I said that, I think someone said, well, which country are you talking about? I said, this country. You know, and this is because women can't access long-acting reversible contraception. And the reality is that abortion rates are going up in this country, not in young girls, but in older women, 35 to 45-year-olds, because they can't access good long-acting reversible contraception. And cervical screening has gone down to a 20-year all-time low because they can't access appointments. So once again, the message is we need an overarching women's health strategy that allows women to maintain their lives and their health rather than waiting for them to get ill. And my ask now, and I hope the DH strategy call will come up with this, is that we start to develop women's health hubs in every town, so that not every GP practice necessarily wants to specialise in women's health, but we must be able to have women's health hubs where women can go. You know, your wife or your daughter, Roger, can go for half an hour to an appointment and have the cervical smear or the contraception or their HRT or their problem periods or whatever sorted out. It's not rocket science, it's very simple stuff, but the services need to be built around the girls and the women, not make them all go around all of our secondary, primary and tertiary facilities.
Right. It's a big theme for the Royal Society of Medicine that, you know, the medicine's much too siloed. And to some extent, the RSM is siloed with all its sections. We love our sections, they're so valuable. But one of the things we're trying to do now is to get them to work together to talk about all embracing themes like women's health and climate change. So don't go away, Lesley. I've got a few announcements to make. One thing I just remembered, actually, when you were talking about Wellbeing of Women, is Wellbeing of Women and Tough, the Urology Foundation, are doing a joint trek to Machu Picchu, which I'm actually going on, if I'm allowed to, because of COVID and so on, in October. So if anybody would like to join, they could speak to either WOW or Tough and find out more about that. So we always say at the end of this, these In Conversation, that the Royal Society of Medicine provides these programs to you for free, but of course, we don't get them for free. There is a cost in putting them together and a cost of running the RSM, although our building's closed and we can't rent out our lecture theatres or run our restaurant or so on. So if there are generous people out in the audience who would like to support the ongoing work of the RSM in teaching and training and inspiring young doctors, I think we've got lots of comments saying how inspiring you've been, Lesley. So thank you for that. So tomorrow, the RSM is running a COVID program at 12:30 lunchtime to talk about the issue of cardiac implications of COVID. And in the evening, we're lucky to have Jane McQuitty, wine correspondent of the Times, to talk about some very nice Australian wines. And if you haven't registered, you can still do so for free. A bit late now to order the wine, but always fun to hear her talking about the wine. Next Wednesday, I already mentioned, Sir Michael Marmot will be joining me to talk about inequalities and COVID. And don't forget Simon Wesley, Sunday morning, He's just sent a message in that he's going to be hiding under the bedclothes because he's so embarrassed to be on desert islanders. But I bet it'll be pretty lively, a pretty lively show. So Lesley, thank you so much. I really, you're such an easy person we could have carried on this conversation for at least another half an hour, maybe a whole hour, but we've run out of time now. So thank you so much. You have truly been an inspiration, and it's wonderful that you and Claire and Sally and all those amazing women have done so much for medicine, and hopefully inspired so many younger women to follow in your footsteps. So good night and thank you.
Thank you, Roger.